Well, you have more than you bargained for today. This sermon is a sermon about a sermon, at least in part, or a speech that seems like a sermon. 2 for 1. The speech is Paul's famous speech in front of the Areopagus, the word that refers either to the Council of the Areopagus, the chief Roman court in Athens, or the Areopagus Hill near Hierapolis. The speech was prompted by an exchange between Paul in Athens and the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers who were there. Paul had noticed that the city was full of idols, and Paul was distressed by that. The philosophers thought Paul was a proclaimer of foreign divinities, so they wondered what this babbler, as they called him, had to say. The speech is his response. It appeared to be a failure by many standards. The response was grumbling on the part of the listeners, unlike the success of Peter, who preached to 3,000 and then 5,000 people. Now, one more comment about this speech. It may not have been by Paul at all. Scholars have never concluded exactly who wrote it, but many believe that Luke wrote the speech Paul never gave. Luke has something important he wanted to say, and he used Paul as the means to say it. Now, if this sounds strange to you, just think of the times you sit and listen to a sermon, and you think to yourself that the preacher is saying something, and you have a better idea. You know what the preacher ought to be saying. I've done this myself as a listener, and once in a while, I've even done it to myself in the middle of preaching a sermon. The problem in Athens was that one group of people counted on idols, small gods, if you will, as their source of meaning and comfort and strength. And Paul entered to take a different point of view, that no God could truly be trusted other than the one God and God's Son, Jesus. He did not mention Jesus by name, but it was clear what Paul meant. It would be easy for Paul to have dismissed the Athenians, but he doesn't. He takes the people and the small gods seriously. He knows that beneath the objects were philosophies. I see how extremely religious you are in every way, he said, for as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship. I don't believe that was just a clever rhetorical device, but rather an indication that he actually paid attention to what they took seriously. He actually listened. He tried to get to know the people. If all this seems difficult to understand, think for a moment of shiny objects. Now, I know that's a term from our generation. It's actually a term that's been around for quite a few years and has often been used first in business applications. It can mean being easily distracted in an entrepreneurial way by an idea that appears to have great business potential. One idea then leads to another idea and then to another. It's been adopted for more general use about being distracted by something, like shiny objects. Many ideas can become attractive. So many, in fact, that nothing takes hold. Although not being clinically diagnosable, shiny object syndrome, as it has sometimes been called, has even informally acquired a Latin name, seemingly to give it some substance. Objectivius shinium syndromus. Quite a name. Thinking of shiny objects as the contemporary equivalent of the small gods, of course, has its limitations. What is comparable, however, I believe, is the power that small gods and shiny objects have over us. Paul understood power. He understood that the power had to be taken seriously and not quickly dismissed. But he also knew that the human spirit ultimately was not looking for the latest trend or something that caught their attention just for a moment. At the same time, he also knew the human disappointment when that which was enduring and could be counted on in the past seemed to be faltering. He knew the power of disappointment when relying on the familiar was disrupted, when what had stood the test of time was suddenly removed and left people feeling abandoned. I believe Jesus also took the problem of the shiny object, if you want to call it that, seriously too. Now, he would never have described it that way, but think for a moment of our gospel for today. Jesus is saying farewell again in this week's gospel, just as he did in last week's gospel. He's preparing disciples for the future, and he anticipated their distress from their perception that they would lose him. He promised not to leave them orphaned. Now that's quite a strong word that goes with strong feelings. He knew that he needed to take this feeling of loss seriously. Jesus might even have wondered if they had on their minds the question that was asked of Jesus in a different time and place. Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? Shiny objects abound. And then he offered the sending of the advocate. He did what Paul did, proclaimed the centrality and enduring presence of the one God. God was in Jesus, and God was in the advocate, or what is called the paraclete, which means one called to the side of. Jesus tells them that the loss of seeing Jesus, the loss of his familiar presence, need not result in being distracted by shiny objects, by looking for another. Instead, the advocate by their side would make present what other translations call the counselor or the comforter. In other words, they would not be left alone. The reassurance of God's presence in the future was crucial, just as the experience and the history of God's presence in the past had guided earlier generations. At the same time, not everything would be done by God or by Jesus or by anticipation of the advocate. They had to do their part too. When the shiny objects glistened in the corner of their eyes, when they were tempted to look for another, the disciples were to remember that loving Jesus and keeping his commandments were the way to keep their focus on what truly mattered. And remember always that the commandments were not rules, but descriptions of relationships. And those relationships were based on love. Love that Paul said on another occasion, never ends. So let's take the small gods or shiny objects seriously and not try to easily dismiss or discount them by pretending they are not real or not important to others and sometimes even to ourselves. Then let's ask some questions. I'll leave you with a few now. How do we distinguish between the passing and the eternal? How do we distinguish between something that catches our attention in the moment and something that will last? Where do we place our trust? Where do we find meaning? Where do we derive the strength, the spiritual strength we need to carry on? How do relationships with God and one another sustain us? What can we do to nurture those relationships? What stands in the way of connecting with the living God? And how do we clear the way? To whom and for what do we give thanks? As we ask those questions, may all our striving and those questions lead us always to the one God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, the God who gives all mortals life and breath and all things. Thanks be to God.